Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More concerns over not just the long-term viability of the NDIS, but where its billions are getting spent. With news today that serial sex offender Wayne Wilmot, involved in the horrific rape and murder of a 20-year-old Janine Balding in the 1980s, is about to get out of prison and straight onto the NDIS. Regional communities are really taking the fight up to Chris Bowen over renewables, and it's not just the massive transmission lines impacting farmers, but the sheer contempt being shown them by the government over lack of consultation and planning. Will cross live to regional Victoria for the latest. Plus further confirmation that cost of living is the #1 concern, with the IMF confirming Australia now leads the world in mortgage pain, citing high immigration and sluggish housing supplies. Yet the latest immigration stats show the government has no plans to rein it in. And Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill finally fronting the media 5 days on from the latest illegal boat arrival. But what's galling is her audacity in trying to blame the people smuggling that's occurred on her watch on the very people who actually stopped the boats previously.
I've been a bit disappointed in recent days to see people that I actually respect in the opposition coming out and, telling untruths about this and calling into question aspects of this policy. The Commander of Operation Sovereign Borders has been really open. That provides an alternative narrative for people smugglers, and I ask them to stop doing it.
You can bet I will come back to Claire O'Neill. But first, the latest mixed signal being sent in our increasingly confused and conflicted society is the leaked news about the recommendation for another so-called safe injecting room in the Melbourne CBD. Now, that's the same CBD that's struggling to get back on its feet post-COVID, with business after business closing down. Floors of office buildings still empty as a scourge of work from home continues, grotty streets and poorly lit areas that just don't feel safe at night. Throw in another injecting room. There's one already about 2 kilometres from the city, and you might as well give up on Melbourne, because an injecting room will send it down the road of Seattle or San Francisco in the US. A shadow of its former self, no longer the world's most livable city. A city instead branded by the world's longest lockdowns, politicians that have given up on Melbourne by rolling over to the hard left drug lobby. Now, the hard left, the Greens in particular, want free and easy access to illegal drugs in Australia. And Labor benefit from preferences from a whole host of feeder parties on the left, like the Cannabis Party. Now, they think it buys them the vote of drug-friendly young people, but at what cost to these young people and what cost to our society more generally? I mean, are we or are we not concerned about the use of illicit drugs in Australia? If these drugs like heroin, ice, meth, cocaine, ecstasy and fentanyl are health-destroying, life-wrecking scourges that we know they are, then we should be doing everything we can to stamp them out. No ifs, no buts. The message should be that illegal drugs destroy lives and should never be used. And those that do should be subject to heavy penalties. Dealers should be locked up for long-term sentences, and criminal gangs of bikies behind the drug trade should be ruthlessly crushed. Instead, while keeping these drugs illegal on paper, we increasingly tolerate users. We go soft on dealers, and we seem to regard criminal gangs as an unaffordable fact of life. Without any electoral mandate, there are now illicit drug pill testing facilities opening up in Brisbane this week, facilities already in place in Canberra, and a trial about to start in Sydney. Now, Labor love a trial, don't they? It's a so-called trial. I mean, they rule this stuff out before an election, they order a trial afterwards, and then present it as some sort of fait accompli a year or so later. Now, presumably, people picked up for drug possession in these cities will now just tell police, I'm on my way to get this tested, and then get let off. Indeed, in Canberra, there are much heavier fines for speeding than for the possession of illicit drugs like heroin. Now, that's the double standard of these times, isn't it? The same double standard that says politicians want Melbourne to improve, but then want to saddle it with an injecting room. And we know this is likely due to the now leaked report by former Police Commissioner Ken Lay that the Premier still refuses to officially release. Remember, a so-called safe injecting room is something that the Andrews government promised not to introduce before an election and duly proceeded with via a so-called trial immediately afterwards. Now, Ken Lay was commissioned to write the report on another injecting room, but the government first sat on his report, then they told him to go away and revise it. And it's now the leaked report, the revised report that's in our hands. It recommends a second injecting room for Melbourne, this one in the CBD, and not just a shooting gallery for users to inject their drug of choice, but there's also a plan from Lay that includes mobile vans to collect the drug users and take them to the facility. So a taxpayer-funded Uber of a sorts for drug addicts, I kid you not. Now, as someone who routinely drives past the first facility in Richmond and often watches the fights and antisocial behaviour, and even, I hasten to say, in the middle of the day, the prostitution associated with users and drug dealers that all congregate around this facility next to a primary school, to put all of this into the CBD is madness. What tourists are left coming to Melbourne will simply just go elsewhere. And if this really is about saving lives by helping people ruin their lives injecting heroin, then put these drug facilities inside a hospital, not on the street next to restaurants and cinemas and theatres. Only we know they won't go into hospitals because the nursing union would go berserk. It is a joke. This is a country with a jihad against vaping and against alcohol, but that's soft on far worse drugs with shocking ramifications for mental as well as physical health. But the double standards are not just with the government. The same AFL that loves to lecture us about gay pride rounds and The Voice is turning a blind eye to orchestrated drug cheating in a game that wants to try and promote itself as clean. It's turning a blind eye to players who use illicit drugs, allowing them to test pre-match to get around the WADA anti-doping rules on game day. And this is happening in a sport where hundreds of millions of dollars are punted each year on betting. Now, if you don't care about integrity in sport, at least abide by the laws around gambling integrity. Dick Pound, the founding president of the World Anti-Doping Authority, compared the AFL's behaviour as akin to that of the Russians and East Germans in the 1970s and 80s when the Olympics was under such a cloud. Now, we're often dismayed when sports stars fail to be the role models we'd like them to be. But this is not immature footballers setting a terrible example. This is the code's peak administrators telling people it's okay to break the law, letting players use drugs and keep their spot in the team. What sort of message does this send our kids? How does any parent counter that message from the AFL and the injecting room one from the government and then say to their kids, don't waste your life using illicit drugs? How hard all of this must be on our police, charged with enforcing drug laws that politicians make, but then allowed to be broken like this. Honestly, is it any wonder that society's in such a mess? All right, we'll go now to Canberra for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
A changing of the guard for Australia's top military brass. David Johnston will replace Angus Campbell as the Chief of the Defence Force from July.
Vice Admiral Johnston is a proven leader with the experience, intellect and resolve to lead the ADF.
Johnston is the first naval officer to lead the armed forces in over 2 decades.
And this is a moment where we need a safe pair of hands. This will be a time where having somebody from the Navy in the top job will be very worthwhile.
I am very conscious of the responsibility that comes with the role, the strategic environment in which we face ourselves.
Canada has flagged it would like to explore joining the AUKUS Security Alliance.
We have had excellent conversations with both the US, the UK and Australia.
The main game of AUKUS remains three-way collaboration on nuclear-powered submarines. But other partners like Japan could join the secondary tier, working on hypersonics, cyber and AI.
What we'll look at is project by project, the desirability of further engagement.
So our job is to join up with like-minded partners to make sure that we can keep peace.
We oppose relevant countries cobbling together exclusionary small circles and creating bloc confrontations.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has warned Israel against invading Rafah after this comment from Benjamin Netanyahu.
It will happen. There is a date.
I have directly put to Prime Minister Netanyahu Australia's concern about a ground invasion of Rafah and the consequences that would be there.
While the US has also warned a Rafah invasion risks further isolating Israel around the world, here at home, a different emphasis from the opposition.
Clearly, if it is to be undertaken, it must be undertaken with extreme care, caution and regard for international law.
And just in the Brittany Higgins case, the defamation case actually, brought by Bruce Lerman, we've learned that the judgment will come down on Monday around 10 o'clock. Of course, we'll cover that on Monday night. But there's a little more in terms of a submission from Brittany Higgins. It's just gone up on the Federal Court website. We're working our way through that, and I'll have an update for you on the detail in that submission a little later in the show. For more on the headlines now, I'm joined by Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh and Cam Redden. Well, thank you to you both. We're missing Andrew Clennell. He's off sick. We wish him all the best. But let's start with that report from the Australian Financial Review today that says the top jobs for the Australian Federal Police, our domestic spy agency ASIO, the Australian Signals Directorate and Border Force, that's a pretty big quaddie there. They'll all fall vacant in coming months. Trudy, we saw, of course, there in the package, the new Defence Force Chief announced today. He's a very safe pair of hands. Vice Admiral David Johnson, but all those other roles, ASIO and Border Force in particular, hugely important given the domestic terror risk we've been told that there is, and also this resurgence in illegal boat traffic. I have to say, if I was back in the Prime Minister's office, I'd be recommending you roll over some of these incumbents, because changing all of them at the same time involves a lot of risk, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and you can see a case I can see, particularly for the ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, to get a term extension. We saw that when Labor came into office with the Chief of Defence, that Angus Campbell was given a 2-year extension to ensure there was continuity. I can see that happening for ASIO. As for Border Force, Michael Outram, he's already been given an extension once to get him to this November. If you were looking at a political case for Labor, if they want to reset politically when it comes to boats, changing the Border Force commander in Michael Outram would give them a fresh face, an opportunity to try and say we are cracking down on these boat arrivals, 3 in the space of a couple of months, arriving seemingly undetected. So a big task ahead of this government, these series of appointments they need to work through. Some of the others are not so imminent, but those 2 posts, the AFP commissioner as well, big decisions need to be made in that area.
Oh, well, I would say with Outram, I mean, he was there when the boats were stopped. Most of Border Force were. Obviously, we haven't got Mike Pizzullo, the chief there anymore, the secretary of the department. But I mean, the issue, Trudy, is the change in personnel at the political level. That's the difference. And that's only an election can make that change. Let's go to that research from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, that's found interest rate hikes have hit Australian households harder than anywhere else in the world. Now, that's part due to our very low share of fixed rate mortgages, heavy household debt burdens and, of course, limited housing supply. Cam, it might surprise people at home to know that only 15% of us have got a fixed rate mortgage compared to homeowners in the US. They're at 90% in terms of fixed loans. And, of course, they pay the one rate for the whole lifetime of the loan. So if you get a 30-year loan and you come in at 5.5% on your mortgage, you stay 5.5 all the way through the life of the loan. But you look at those sort of that data out today, you look at those graphs and you realise it's any wonder we're in a cost of living crisis.
And of course, the other point with the United States, Peter, is in a dozen of those states, if you can't pay your loan, you can just stick the keys in the door and walk away and the bank is left to sell it. And if they are the ones that end up with a loss, well, tough luck. That's a power that many mortgage owners in the US have. Of course, you can't do that in Australia here. So many families are tied to the family home for better or worse, even if they have stretched themselves so far to get in the door in the first place. And now so many millions of Australians are really at the whim of the Reserve Bank, and some of those hopes of a rate cut by the end of the year, Peter, are fast dying off and dying out. We've got unemployment still well below 4. We had that shock figure of February at 3.7%. We've got inflation still above 4 at a quarterly basis. And where I think this really becomes an electoral challenge too, Peter, is as the number of renters rises in the voting population, of course, making up a third of all Australian voters, a third of them rent, that base is there for the taking. We've seen the Greens vote surge amongst renters, even to a point where in the latest news poll, the primary vote for the Greens and the coalition amongst renters is basically neck and neck, because some of those offerings are appealing to renters. The Greens have got an electoral currency amongst people who are aspirational, trying to get into a home, but they feel like it's out of reach. So this is going to be a real battleground in the next election. We've seen the coalition really double down on the view of offering super as a way of trying to get into a home, but it doesn't seem to be showing that that's winning people over. Instead, that Greens base amongst renters and young Australians continues to rise. So expect this to be a real battleground, not just in the weeks and months after the budget, but right the way through to election day next year.
I think speculation about RBA cutting rates, Cam, is going to absolutely dominate the political chatter out of Canberra. The government needs a win in this area because they cannot spend enough in the budget, I think, to make a meaningful difference without really spiking inflation. So that'll be the challenge for Jim Chalmers in May. What about this stuff today, Trudy, about all the investors in the renewables energy space saying that they will walk as much as $5 trillion worth of investment will go overseas if, no surprises here, they don't get more subsidies? I mean, talk about renewables being cheap. It's a money pit.
Well, they've got their hand out, but I reckon they're about to get a whole lot more cash. That's certainly the expectation given Chris Bowen. You don't forget this capacity investment scheme. It's been announced before, but he's promising, Chris Bowen, to give us more details in the next few weeks as to how it works. Essentially, it's underwriting new renewable projects to get them in the grid by 2030, but we don't know how much it's going to cost. This is a reverse auction scheme. Chris Bowen saying we'll have some more details in a few weeks, but expect big numbers in that front. I mean, any path you go down is going to cost the taxpayer money here. Prolonging coal, getting more gas into the system, even Peter Dutton's nuclear push, let's be frank, is going to cost the taxpayer a lot of money.
I reckon if you aggregate the cost of all the money we spent on renewables up to date, nuclear is a cheap option. I'll do the maths on that and come back tomorrow. Hey, let's go to this, the boats issue. It hasn't gone away, Cam Redden. Of course, we saw Claire O'Neill front the media finally after the latest arrival of people turning up. No boat, though. The boat had dropped and disappeared, and that's a worry in itself. Turned up on the WA coast. Interestingly, we learned that our resettlement deal with New Zealand may be at risk. Now, this is important because when we couldn't get people resettled off Nauru, you'll remember New Zealand took them. That deal will end in June next year. There's a new government, of course, in New Zealand, quite a conservative government. Only 4 out of 39 men found recently in the Kimberley back in February, they've been assessed as refugees, meaning that most of them are not. Most are economic migrants. But if we have got more boats coming, what happens if New Zealand says, no, we're not taking any more?
That's a very good question, Peter. And of course, one of the interesting details about that deal is there was a few criteria to it. It was a 3-year deal signed between Australia and New Zealand. And part of the deal was to take 150 refugees resettled every year for a total of 450. We haven't even got to 150 resettled total in New Zealand. I think the latest count I saw was 135 all up for the course of this deal. So there's quite a fair bit of headway if there was to be a late rush between now and then. But in terms of an ongoing deal, short of extending it or finding some other way to make up those numbers, we have seen the government, and we've learnt much of this through the High Court documents that were revealed through the NZYQ case. We've seen some of the lengths the government has been willing to go to essentially shop around and try and find countries that are willing to resettle people that we do not want to keep here. And if we learnt one other lesson from the NZYQ case, of course, another High Court case set for next week. This is the case of ASF 17, which could see the release of more detainees. We know 2 things, that indefinite detention no longer an option. So the government really in a corner here, needing to find somewhere to resettle people that it does not want to keep in the Australian community. but also the challenge of not getting caught out, of not having a solution when the clock hits zero. The government is so determined after the NZYQ case to not be in another situation where it is caught short without legislation or without another tool in the toolkit. So they failed to get that rush through before this next High Court case. Between now, legislation, I should say, in the last sitting period. So between now and when this New Zealand deal does eventually run out, I'm sure we'll see every effort taken to try and get something over the line. The government does not want to put its hand in its pocket and come up empty.
No, they don't. Well, this is a political issue come campaign time too. Hey, let's go with this headline news out of Victoria, because it could be a template deal for the CPSU right across the country. Victorian public servants, Trudy, are soon going to have access to reproductive leave for the first time ever under a new 4-year pay deal. The Community and Public Sector Union says it settled the negotiations with the Allen government. It's a new enterprise agreement, a 3% pay rise. If you can believe it, every public servant in Victoria will get $5,600 worth of a one-off bonus for cost of living. Cost of living, I might add, that's costing Victorian taxpayers something like $300 million. But this too, entitlements for women's health and reproductive rights. Let's not forget anyone can be a woman in Victoria if they say they were a woman, including menstruation and menopause. Now, two things here. Where are the productivity improvements that come with this? Because I can't see them in Victoria. And surely getting leave for your period, isn't that what we have sick leave for?
Well, Peter, this is going to be the template, though, that Victoria now successfully able to secure this, the union there. I know Queenslanders have a similar push with the state government underfoot at the moment. The ACTU backs this in. This will be a big debate at their national conference in the middle of this year. The Federal Employment Minister, Tony Burke's been asked whether this becomes a federal priority to get this into the national employment standards along with other leave. We saw domestic violence leave added to leave entitlements. He says for now they're sticking with their IR template they've already got in there, Peter. But watch this space as to where this goes. Once it's in place, it's hard for me to see that it would ever get taken away. Business, as you say, though, believe this should just be part of normal entitlements that you already have in terms of personal leave and sick leave.
And I would agree with that. And I will look forward to reporting here of the first biological man who seeks to have menstruation leave in Victoria, because that will come. All right. Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Trudy. After the break, we'll cross live to regional Victoria for an update on how residents are dealing with Labor's new planning laws that in effect ignore their concerns around the massive renewables rollout. Plus, a little later, that shocking news today that the NDIS will support one of Australia's worst sex offenders, even though experts say he's made no meaningful gains in terms of rehab whilst in prison. Welcome back. Still to come. Concern mounts for the NDIS workers soon to have to work with a notorious sex offender involved in one of Australia's most horrific rape and murder cases once he's released from prison. But first, we've spoken often about how the renewables rollout in regional Australia is being opposed by many locals who are worried about the impacts for their farmers and their country communities. My next guest is the Deputy Executive Director at the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild, who comes to us tonight from St Arnaud, 3 hours west of Melbourne in Victoria's Wimmera, and he's there talking to concerned locals. Daniel, we've discussed this before, but since you were there last time, the government's announced an overhaul of the state's planning laws, removing third-party appeals in an effort to fast-track the renewables rollout. What are the main concerns of the local community with these planning approval changes?
Well, thanks, Peter, and a credit to you for following this critically important story that's happening here and also many other parts of Australia. Earlier today, we were in Manu, which is just out of St Arnaud, talking to local farmers and landowners about these changes. And the basic feedback was that these changes, which will greatly reduce the amount of time that is needed for a renewables project to be approved from 2 years down to 4 months, are designed to shut out the local community from having their say on this issue. It will limit their ability to appeal decisions that are made, and it's being done without any consultation with the locals that will be affected. The key issue here is you've got government and big business and the Australian energy market operator that are acting without any social licence. They are intruding on private farmland. They're not including the community with them. And this will severely undermine the capacity of this part of the world and this state to produce the food and fibre for our nation and around the world.
There are issues too, so people understand this, with large-scale renewable rollouts in terms of not just the transmission lines across farms and the inability to use aerial firefighting, let's say, or spraying, or an auger, which has got a large sort of top to it, or large headers, of course, that's a big issue out there in the Wimmera, but also the degradation of the soil underneath a solar farm that might be there for 25 years, the runoff changes that will the cause. And when I was in Witchyproof, not far from St Arnaud, of course, a local said to me, we are sick to death of being told what to do by greenies in Melbourne and Canberra. They said to me that they were going to fight it absolutely as hard as they can. What's the mood where you are?
Well, the mood is exactly that. It's one of resolve and resilience. This is a very tough community, a very tight-knit community, and they've made it clear that, as is currently planned, these proposals will not go ahead without their consent on their private farmland, because to do so would simply be un-Australian. I mean, this should not be happening in our country when you have government operators coming onto private farmland without any permission. We also know, Peter, that this is not just a local issue, whether you're in Mudgee, whether you're in Rockhampton, or any other part of the country which is slated for these renewables projects. There are dozens of communities that are going through this issue. And we know it's not just local, it's about food security. You know, this net zero renewables policies of the federal government is going to turn Australia from a net exporter of food to a net importer of food, because you cannot operate farmland and wind turbines and solar panels and high transmission lines at the same time.
Let's go to a related issue, and this is one of insurance, because I mean this is the myriad of problems that come with a poorly thought through rollout process. Farmers who adjoin a property in the King Valley area, so this is northeast Victoria, there's a $750 million solar farm planned to go in. It's proposed at this stage. And farmers that sit around this property say federal and state governments haven't listened enough to them. They are concerned about insurance. Their properties will be uninsurable if this goes ahead due to the extreme cost of covering accidental fires. Now, we know this is also an issue I've spoken to farmers about in relation to ensuring their wind farms, due to the proximity of wind farms, going to that point I made before about aerial firefighting near them. Now, if you can't insure your farm and your home, that's unacceptable.
It is unacceptable, and you're right to point this out. There's a couple of things, Peter. Firstly, these are the kinds of realities and practicalities of running a farm that the inner city ideologues just do not understand. The other point is that on a recent trip we had to the Western Districts of Victoria, we spoke with the CFA official who was raising these exact issues, also in relation to the transmission lines and the towers. I mean, these are massive towers. Anyone that's driven past these towers know how big they are. And what he put to us was that the firefighters would not be able to go in and fight a fire were it taking place in or around these massive transmission towers. Now, this is a huge fire risk in a part of the country that is bushfire prone, and heaven forbid anything happen, but we have to operate on the assumption that something will happen. These kind of practicalities just are not being taken into consideration. So in addition to being a massive food security problem, it is also a bushfire risk problem where we're just not going to be able to get on top of these fires, and they could cause a lot of damage.
Now, people know I've got family on the land in Victoria, and I'd heard all this anecdotal talk over the Christmas period about farmers they knew in their area that had to basically fire sale livestock because they looked at the weather forecast from the Bureau of Meteorology back in October. It was going to be a terrible summer. There wouldn't be enough feed around, possibly not even enough water. So everything went off to the sale yards and they got rock bottom prices. Well, that was just anecdotal. Today we've got data out from Elders, the big agribusiness player, that's revealed the BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology's mistaken prediction of El Nino significantly impacted their earnings. Of course, as I say there, we had a whole lot of farmers panic sell livestock, and the price of beef fell and other farm products fell as well. Surely when you look at this, when you get this empirical, fact-based data, Daniel, there's got to now be a proper review of the Bureau and their forecasting out of this?
Well, of course there should be, Peter. There's that issue that you identify. There's also the issue with their what's called homogenisation of historical temperature data, which basically has the effect of creating the impression that temperatures have risen faster and are higher than what may actually be the case. And we also know, Peter, that of course everybody makes mistakes, but there is a component of the Bureau which appears to be driven by ideology and by politics rather than by the facts on the ground. Australians should be able to have trust in the Bureau. It's been historically a critically important institution for our nation, especially for regions and for farmers. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that when there is a bad prediction, as you pointed out, it does have real world consequences, sometimes dramatic consequences for farmers and those on the ground, and often those in the inner cities just don't understand that.
What about this stuff out today from the Climate Council? So they don't just want the government to ban the sale of petrol cars and diesel cars in Australia by 2035. They don't just want us to drive electric vehicles only. They actually want us to throw away all cars, even including electric cars. They want to get us walking and cycling and using public transport. And they basically want to drive out vehicles altogether. Now, they're influential. They've got the ear of government. What do you think about this, Daniel Wild?
Well, they've got an all-access pass to Chris Bowen's office, I'm sure about that, and to Anthony Albanese, and this is concerning. And it's just another example of the attacks on the Australian way of life. You know, you have these inner-city ideologues, they go to Europe, they go to Amsterdam, and they say, oh, Australia should be like that. Well, we're not built like that. We're a different country. And it's an example of how they are imposing more intrusion on us. This is all what net zero looks like in practice, Peter. Like, we're talking about the transmission lines, and the wind turbines and the solar panels. It's the cars that you're allowed to drive, the food that you're allowed to eat, the houses you're allowed to live in, the extent to which you're allowed to travel on planes and go on holidays. This is what net zero does. It greatly empowers the central bureaucracy to make decisions about your life and about what you can do. And look, it just ignores any practical reality. Try being a plumber and getting from one job site to another on a bike or on a train. It just doesn't work. But unfortunately, like I say, they've got an all-access pass straight into the top of government.
Well, good on you for getting out of Melbourne, getting out to St Arnaud and talking to real people, because I think this is where the rubber hits the road. And I think this in part is why the polling shows that people are willing, even if they're not in love with the idea of nuclear, they are willing and wanting to have a rational national debate to avoid all the stuff you've just discussed. Daniel Wild, thank you. Catch up with you soon. All right, just before the break, as I mentioned, news this afternoon that after delaying his decision to hear new evidence from former Spotlight producer Taylor Orbach, Justice Michael Lee will now hand down his decision in the Bruce Lerman defamation case on Monday at 10:15 in the morning. But also revealed in documents is that Brittany Higgins has questioned whether she might have been drugged on the night she alleged she was raped by Bruce Lerman, a point that she wants the federal court, or wishes the federal court, had explored in the case. Bruce Lerman, of course, has always maintained his innocence. Also, with regards to Higgins and the $2.4 million Commonwealth payment she received, well, the circumstances of this, she says, were prepared, agreed and executed. It hasn't been explored meaningfully in these proceedings, which is why she says she doesn't want Lee, Justice Lee, to make any adverse findings against her in relation to the compensation. She says there's no proper basis to go that far. Very interesting. I can't wait to watch those proceedings before Justice Lee on Monday. And of course, I'll bring you all the detail here on Monday night. After the break, I'll speak with John Anderson about the long-term viability of the NDIS and that shocking story about a sexual predator set to receive massive funding from the scheme. Plus, what the future looks like for retirees when, as a country, we seem hell-bent on demonising all the things that have made us prosperous. Welcome back. Still to come, does the fact that we're demanding our own investigation into Israel's IDF strike mean that other nations will now launch investigations into our soldiers in places like Afghanistan? Is this tit for tat really a smart idea? But first, sometimes you wonder if what you read is a mistake, and then you're staggered that it isn't. Today, an exclusive story in The Australian that one of the country's worst serial sex offenders, Wayne Wilmot, who was involved in the brutal 1980s abduction, rape and murder of 20-year-old Janine Balding, will be let out of prison with the support of an expensive NDIS package. Wilmot was sentenced to 8 years over the rape and abduction of Balding, only then to be released on parole, where he went on to commit several serious violent crimes and sexual attacks on women and men. Now, beyond questions about the appropriateness of taxpayer money being used to support Wilmot, there are grave concerns about the safety of any NDIS worker in contact with this convicted predator. A forensic psychologist told the court that the most likely risk scenario for Wilmot was, and I quote, most likely to involve a penetrative sexual attack on a young woman previously unknown to him. Now, this isn't an isolated case. We've also learned today in the Sydney Morning Herald that the NDIS has a growing role in supervising and supporting sex offenders, some of whom are on packages worth over $1 million. Joining me now to discuss the long-term prognosis for the NDIS is former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Well, John, I don't think the NDIS was first envisioned by anyone thinking it would be used to pay for and supervise violent sex offenders and pedophiles.
Peter, I must begin by saying that I think we all recognise that there are Australians who really do need support, and you and I both know, and all of our listeners will know, that there are carers too who do an incredible job and need our support. But I think the point I'd want to go to first here is that you and I both have been involved in public policy. Badly thought out public policy truly bites the community in serious ways. So from that era when Prime Minister Gillard was throwing vast amounts of money at education and vast amounts of money at the NDIS, the reality is that neither were well enough designed to deliver anything like value for the taxpayer. The education revolution, as it was known, has seen us roughly double, I think, expenditure on education for worse outcomes. The NDIS, from day one, there were hard heads everywhere warning that it was poorly designed, that it would encourage rent seekers, that it wasn't effective in screening out those who would want to rort it. The Australian Investigative Commission, I can't remember its full name, last year, that found that somewhere between 15 and 20% of NDIS revenues are being misallocated, if you like. The system is being rorted. The fact that we're now spending more on it than we are on defence and more than we are on Medicare. The states have successfully washed their hands and cost shifted. And I think I'm right in saying the Australian Financial Review estimates that by the middle of the 2030s, this might be costing us $125 billion a year. This is extraordinary stuff. And then we discover it's being used as a sort of de facto penalty system as well.
And I guess the problem for Bill Shorten here, and I'll be sympathetic to Bill Shorten, although he was there when it was poorly designed at the outset with Julia Gillard, was that he has now taken this as an issue to the states. He's written to them, it's reported this afternoon, saying you cannot turn it into a dumping ground for released criminals. The problem is, and you alluded to it then, when it was established, Gillard had her back to the wall politically. Kevin Rudd was coming after her. Of course, he eventually got her. But she was trying to do deals to get big policies like the NDIS over the line and hope it might protect her from Rudd's coming back. And one of the things she did with the NDIS was it's not run like a normal government department, so people don't front estimates. Departments aren't accountable in that way. They've got free call on the Treasurer for whatever funds they need. It's uncapped, so someone could have a package that's worth $2 million, it could be worth $10 million. That's just in the gift to whoever is the assessor. But also, if there are any changes to the design of the scheme, like Shorten's saying now, we don't want prisoners and pedophiles and others to be able to access the scheme, all the states have to come together and agree. Now, we can see with the Commission in relation to the GST, I mean, that just doesn't happen. So unfortunately, I think we've got a bugger's muddle here. I think we have got really badly designed policy with basically an open checkbook on the taxpayer.
Well, I entirely agree. And Peter, it's not as if there were not hard-headed people who understand how government policy and how economics work and how really governments actually can run businesses that were not warning at the time that it was badly designed and that it would attract the rent seekers, I mentioned a moment ago, and blow out hopelessly in cost. It's exactly what's happened. What should we take out of it? Well, there's a lot of things we should take out of it, but public policy matters, and public policy can only be put in place if you have coherent government, properly led. So part of the plea has to be for leadership in the future, because this thing's growing at over 10% a year. I understand that 11% of our boys now are on NDIS programs. The most extraordinary things are funded. There are anecdotal stories everywhere of outrageous abuses. Now we learn about sexual predators effectively, if you like, I suppose you could say the state's passing the cost of imprisonment of people who should frankly not be out in the community over to the Commonwealth. Well, that's ingenious for their books, but it's very, very bad policy for the rest of it, at a time when I think young women particularly must wonder what on earth they might be exposed to in terms of the federal government allowing inappropriate people to go loose in the community.
A lot of people contact me, John. They watched the launch last year of ARC, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the big conference in London. I was there in London. You're on the board of ARC. You were heavily involved. You're one of the key speakers on the stage. And they watched it retailed around the world, and they said for the first time in a long time, they had some hope that we could turn the tide. Now, I felt that hope myself. I felt a sense coming out of ARC that we don't have to accept in the West that our best years are behind us. A lot of people ask me, what happens next for ARC? Where are we going from here, John? Is there anything you can tell us?
Yes, I can. I can tell you that it was a great success. There's great demand everywhere, including in Australia, for us to continue to address the great issues confronting us. There will be, the next ARC will be held in London, major ARC event, the mother lode, if you like, in London in February next year. Many more people. We've got a much bigger hall. We'll be exploring the same broad themes, energy and the environment, social fabric and family, our story, and business and prosperity. But where there will be an Australian chapter. It's under construction at the moment. There's a lot of hard work, but there will be an Australian, and we will seek to have the same, if you like, part of our annual event in this country, cultural heritage, if you like, or scenery, high quality events, looking closely at those four themes in the sense of examining how they're playing out in Australia. We want to use good thinking to unpack why things are going wrong and expose the bad thinking that always stands behind problems and point to better thinking as much as anything else for today's leaders and tomorrow's leaders.
Well, more strength to your arm, John Anderson. Thank you for your time. All right, after the break, why aren't neighbouring Muslim countries doing more for the people of Gaza? Plus, Roe versus Wade. It's now front and centre in the US presidential race. So what's it mean for the Biden and Trump camps? Well, join me as they do every Tuesday night. International Issues. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda coming to us, of course, from San Francisco, which makes her very international tonight, and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, Michael, let's start with the government's extraordinary probe. We talked about this last night. I don't think there is a precedent like this, that we are going to distrust the Israeli government. We're going to do our own investigation into the airstrike that killed the 7 aid workers, including one Australian. Reports today that experts say this could open the door for other countries to demand the same sort of access to our own military inquiries. And you and I both know in the past Australian soldiers have been caught up in the alleged deaths of civilians in places like Afghanistan. This is a big risk, isn't it?
Yes, Peter. This is Wong and Albo have opened us up to the 29 investigations that haven't been completed. war crimes investigations against Australian soldiers. But of course, other democracies won't interfere in Australia. They won't be posturing, and I doubt if any country will follow the precedent set by them. Peter, I have to congratulate the ABC 7:30 for the rudest interview I've ever seen them do with the IDF's spokesman, Peter Lerner, which was directly on this. But he did say something interesting while being patient and enduring that interrogation. He said that the Israeli military judge advocate general is going to launch investigations into whether there should be criminal charges against the two officers who were speedily dismissed for failing to follow standard operating procedures that led to the tragic deaths of those World Food Kitchen workers.
Coach, a two-part question for you. I mean, there's all this talk that the support for Israel is really waning in the States on both sides of the aisle. But also, I'm picking up from people I know over there that abortion is really ramping up as an issue in the campaign. You're in San Francisco. How are you seeing it play out?
So on the Israeli issue, it's really interesting. I was looking into this. Gallup actually has been running the most comprehensive poll since the 1990s on Americans' views on Netanyahu since he first came into office then, as well as on the issue in the region more broadly. And it's really quite remarkable because while right now we're sort of in this hotbed and tensions are running high and it's a very divided country on this issue, it's actually really interesting if you zoom back that there's been this tectonic plate shift where there's almost been a 10-point swing among the electorate in terms of how they support or how much sympathy they feel for Israel versus the Palestinian side of that conflict in that region. And the group that's most stalwart in supporting Israel is actually the baby boomer Republicans. And as they are aging out of the electorate, it's a very tricky situation where a lot of the Democrats that are younger and are fresh immigrants are not as sympathetic to Israel as Americans typically have been. And I think that's what the Democrat Party is grappling with. There's almost a civil war going on within their base, and that's spilling out from time to time in the election. On the abortion piece, look, it's been one of the most winning issues for Democrats, historically always. And the overturning of Roe v. Wade definitely has galvanized and mobilized that group. 60% of women typically vote Democrat versus 40% Republican. For them, this is a big issue. A lot of them consider this a single voter issue. It's the most important issue for them compared to everything else. And Republicans are countering it by saying, well, all Roe v. Wade's overturning did is send power back to the states. In states like California, where I'm sitting right now, they've actually expanded abortion rights. In states like Alabama, they really, really restricted it. And that is actually not playing well. Even Republican women in those states are not happy with how far the pendulum has swung. And so I think it actually is going to cost the Republicans some seats in the Senate and the House, just based on how they're a little bit out of step with where their base is on that issue.
Of course, if people don't like it, they can vote out their various state governments and have those changes made. And then I think that's the point the Supreme Court was making, pushing it back to being a state legislative issue. Michael, I am often asked this question: why aren't neighbouring Muslim countries doing more and taking more citizens out of Gaza?
Well, Egypt fears Hamas practically more than anything. They're an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, and remember, the Muslim Brotherhood nearly took over Egypt. Palestinian Sunni Arabs constitute 70% of Jordan, the state that is next to Israel, and the Jordanian government fears them taking over that country as well. Some people say that would be a good solution. If you wanted to have a Palestinian state, have it in Jordan, where they already constitute 70% of the population, rather than create a new place. But Kuwait kicked them out, the Palestinians, after the Iraq invasion, because they sided with Saddam Hussein. So they have a controversial reputation, and particularly the Hamas Muslim Brotherhood angle is what scares Egypt.
Right, we'll leave it there. Michael Damby, thank you. Well, enjoy San Francisco as much as you can there, Coach. I'll be interested for your reflections when you get home. That's it for me. Thank you for your company. See you tomorrow night. Here's Andrew Bolt.